Good morning, everybody of you, my beloved audience. We have an honorable guest here, Mr. Dr. Tim Anderson. I would like to give in some short introduction, Mr. Tim Anderson or Dr. Tim Anderson, as the expert of counter globalism, or what we call, Doctor.
Counter-hegemonic studies. But
Counter-hegemonic studies.
counter-globalism works too.
Okay. Tell me about counter-hegemonic. It's kind of a science or just discourses? Tell me.
So it's really a group that some of us created some years ago because a lot of the Western discussions, academic discussions, including journals, are very focused to Western political objectives. And so to have discussions that are critical of the imperial neo-colonial aspects of Western politics is difficult sometimes because it's apart from the censorship and the domination of the monopoly media, you have a lot of constraints in the academic side of things too. So we created a virtual center called the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies, which is about sharing discussions and also publishing original research in the area that is to do with the principle of self-determination, with the struggles of indigenous people, with anti-colonial struggles, those sorts of things, with anti-war movements too. And so that's why we have this virtual group.
Okay, Dr. Anderson, do you have a special methodology for this kind of study, because you put study here?
Yeah, no, not a particular methodology, because different methodologies could be used. I myself am a political economist, so I come from a background which looks at structural power relationships, so political economic power relationships. In other words, looking at power relationships and social relationships in a framework which combines the economic with the political and the social with the political.
Okay, economic perspective. Okay, I will more clear question. What kind of backgrounds make you anti-imperialism and hegemony, and how do economic and political linkage support each other?
Okay, if you're asking personally where I came from, I suppose it's because I'm one of those who grew up in the era of the US war against Vietnam. And so that made a lot of us reflect on what were our own states doing in terms of waging a war against an independent people. And this was something that influenced me a lot when I was growing up. And when I began to look at the struggles against the domination by Western powers, and when I say Western powers, we're talking mainly about the USA here, Washington, the regime in Washington, with which my country has always been very closely involved. There isn't really a North American war with which Australia has not participated, basically. There are very few genuinely independent initiatives which the Australian body politic gets involved in. It's typically directed by the needs of Washington. So in that sense, I began to study independent movements in Australia, the Indigenous people struggle in Australia, and also the independent movements around the world in Latin America, for example. I studied Spanish so that I could study the Latin American independence and movements and anti-imperialist movements. And through that, you see some common threads that are linking these self-determination struggles, anti-colonial struggles. There are some common principles in those struggles. And so in looking at counter-hegemonic studies, it's really a field of study with different methods that looks at the liberation movements, at indigenous struggles, resistance, if you like, because there's counter-hegemonic studies and counter-hegemonic activity, which is typically resistance to domination by foreign powers, by powerful interest groups, for example.
Okay, Mr. Anderson, I think we're talking about imperialism. Do you find a new imperialism?
Look, there's been a creature for several centuries, I believe, which I tend to call hegemonic neoliberalism. which is an Anglo-American project. Historically, it's not just Western, it's not just European, it's actually Anglo-American, from the British Empire, from the North American Empire, which they don't want to call an empire, of course. So I've written about this recently, that neoliberalism and imperialism, we have to put them to understand where they come from. They're not really abstract principles when we talk about liberalism and neoliberalism. They are conditioned by this political project, which comes from particular states, powerful states, which have dominated the world for many years and which are in decline at the moment. And that's very interesting. That's why in my teaching, I'm talking about really the problems of self-determination in a post-colonial world, because we have lived for at least half a century now in a supposedly post-colonial world, but there are still important threads of domination, dilemmas for people. You see it in Africa at the moment, with a number of African countries struggling, for example, against the influence of France in the Sahel part of Africa, basically. So although the countries there are supposedly independent, but we still have these very powerful neo-colonial forces, as many people understand very well.
Okay, Mr. Anderson, are you trying to say that you are trying to explain about left socialism, because you do a research in many countries, yeah, like East Timor, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran? What is your thought?
That's right. And there are some common threads there, of course, you will immediately recognize. As someone from Indonesia, you will recognize those colonial, neo-colonial threads there. And as I said,
sorry, Mr. Anderson, do you identify yourself as left socialism?
As, sorry, what?
Left socialism. Socialism.
Yes,
you are part of.
I'm a socialist myself. I believe in developing, enhancing the social values in every society, basically, and the social institutions and the concepts of sharing and the construction of social institutions. And that means against the destruction of social institutions, typically, and the worst offender there is certainly imperialist and neocolonialist powers. They're always focusing on the destruction of authentic domestic social institutions and structures.
Do you have a special figure like Marxist theory?
I think Marx was a brilliant analyst in the 19th century, looking at 19th century European capitalism, and I think he's one of those very important colleagues we have to take into account. I don't want to talk about it as a religion, but certainly we have to consider Karl Marx as an important colleague academically who had a very specific field. I don't think that a lot of European Marxism really deals very well with the colonial world and the post-colonial world. It's not so strong in that area.
Okay. Question 4. How do you analyze the alliance of Russia, China, and Iran? Aren't there three ideologies different? Will the alliance become a new hegemony, or will the world become multipolar?
Yes, it's a good question. It's the question of the day, really. I don't think that it's a new hegemony. It's certainly true that there are distinct histories, distinct cultural traditions, distinct political economic systems, really. But I don't really think that new alliance is about constructing a new hegemony or even a single ideology. It is a strategic alliance, a very important strategic alliance, which shares some common values in terms of opposing a unipolar world, opposing a world that's dominated by the Anglo-American hegemonic neoliberalism or imperialism, if you like. And it's about constructing something which probably is going to take the form of something multipolar, because we don't have even in China, which is the most powerful of those countries, most economically powerful at least, you don't have the signs of a great imperial power in the waiting, although they are certainly seen as rivals by the US. They don't share a lot of the same features as US power in the world today. So I believe that we are looking at the beginnings of a multipolar world at the moment. And already, of course, there is a significant counterweight to Anglo-American domination in terms of technology and commerce, but less so in terms of media and finance. Finance is still very dominated by the USA, for example.
Okay, Mr. Anderson, you are talking about multipolar and value sharing, and I'm trying to forward question about value in this context, which is Islamic value. I put Iran here. We know that China, Russia, and United States basically materialist value. So in five question, it maybe can help you answer. What is your opinion on the concept of resistance against Western hegemony promoted by Iran? What's make different?
I think that's partly true. I wouldn't agree that all of the other cultures are materialistic. Certainly, Western North American culture is imperialistic, but we have to recognize that other non-Islamic cultures have their own spiritual traditions too. It would be wrong to ignore that. For example, there are spiritual traditions in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Russia, for example. And indeed, that's often what grounds the values, the construction of values in their societies. So when it comes to Iran, which of course is a very explicitly Islamic system, and talking about resistance in Islamic terms, it doesn't mean to say that universally we have to see resistance in Islamic terms. I think the way I see it is Islam is a source of inspiration for broader spiritual values. And you can see this already because Iran has important strategic relationships with, for example, from the tour of President Ibrahim Raisi recently to Latin America, developing the strategic relationship that Iran has with Venezuela, which has its own spiritual traditions in a type of Christianity, but not one that's linked to the big European churches. You see that in the thought of Chavez and Maduro. Also with Cuba, which has a humanist tradition, and with Nicaragua, which has its own cultural traditions and its own clash, even though it's largely Christian, its own clashes with the institutional church, the Vatican, for example. So in those strategic relationships, I think we have to understand that Iran shares many values with those countries with which it's engaging. That includes China and Russia, but it doesn't mean to say that there is an imposition of one culture on another. There is clearly a cross-cultural relationship going on there, which identifies shared values. And indeed, if you hear the leader, Ali Khamenei in Iran talking to his strategic partners, he talks in quite, you might say, secular terms or pluralist terms. In a sense, he doesn't rely on Islamic concepts. They're his inspiration, but he uses some more universal concepts to talk. The same with Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon. When he talks more broadly, he's not talking the language of Shia Islam. He's talking about universal humanist values in a way. That's the way I see it, basically. So there has to be a sharing of values in these strategic relationships. And while the religion may inspire those values, they have to be articulated in a way that have deep meaning to those other cultures, whether it's Russia, China, or Venezuela, for example.
Do you trying to say that sharing value here, yeah, is value of resistance? Because I think it is more strategic or through really sharing value. If we are talking about Turkey as a part of NATO is different case, handling case in Suriah. So can I say that the Islamic ideology promoted by Iran is better ideology than Ikhwanul Muslimin ideology?
So Iran, of course, because it has this concept of Islamic civilization at the core of what it's constructing. But nevertheless, you see that strategically, as I said, they have very important non-Islamic partners. And contrary, they have some opponents which regard themselves as Islamic, like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, for example. Now, there is a sort of a relationship, sort of a partnership with Turkey, but also some important conflicts going on because of the role that Turkey is playing in Syria and Iraq at the moment, for example. So Iran has a lot of problems from some of its other nations which identify with Islamic values. So it's not sufficient simply to talk about Islamic values. We have to be rather more specific. And in terms of resistance, it's true that Iran has defined a type of Islam that identifies itself very strongly with resistance. And you see that in in Lebanon too, with the resistance, with the Islamic resistance in Lebanon. But let's remember, look at the big partners regionally that Iran has. Iran is really demonized by Western powers, mainly because of its support for Palestine. Now, in Palestine, you have hardly any Shia Islam, hardly any Shia Muslims. It's really the resistance in Palestine and Iranian approach, which I think is a very good one. It's same as the Syrian approach to Palestine. They support all of the factions of the resistance, and the factions of the resistance in Palestine are Sunni Islamic, socialist, nationalist, a combination of them, you see. So really Iran, even in its backyard, let's say, crosses those sorts of boundaries. With Syria, for example, Syria is, of course, it's a majority Muslim country, but it's not identified as an Islamic country because it has important minorities, including Christian minorities there. And so Syria is really a pluralist state, which specifically even bans political parties based on religion, for example. Nevertheless, the strategic relationship between Syria and Iran is rock solid, very, very deeply rooted there. So resistance crosses, I suggest, cultural barriers.
Yes, Mr. Anderson, it's I won't try to discussion about democracy, imperialism using democracy to press the weak country. So I'm trying to ask you, the compatibility, resistance, democracy, and socialism to counter hegemony.
Well, there's a compatibility with socialism and resistance. Of course, resistance, in a sense, I recall the former Grand Mufti of Syria saying resistance must not be identified with a particular religion, because in the Syrian context, he's looking at a pluralist society, which Syria stresses very strongly. For example, although
that
he
universal
himself
value. You said
yes,
that's
right. Exactly. He's talking about universal values, which, as I said, maybe, in my view, may be inspired by religion, but they cannot be bound or captured by a particular religion because they do cross religions, they cross cultures. And that's why we see the relationship between the resistance factions in Palestine and Iran, for example, the strongest supporter of the resistance in Palestine. They will support all of those factions. And in Syria, it's the same. And Syria has, as I said, a pluralist tradition there, basically. So when they say secular, by the way, in Syria, it's not the same meaning as secular in Latin America or Australia. I noticed something spending some time there. They mean, in Syria, for example, secular means we are not going to impose a particular religion. We are talking about pluralism. We respect all religions, and we will look for those universal values in those religions, for example.
Okay. I asked you about West Asia after Washington. You highlight but West Asia after Washington. Now we are in Pacific, and I'm trying to ask you about East Timor too. Do you really believe that Australia is a part of Washington project in Pacific? Maybe Indonesia will be enemy of Australia. What do you think?
Well, there's always been some tensions in that relationship, of course. But yes, it's certainly true that the Australia, let's say the elite, the regime in Canberra, is certainly very, very much captured by the North American project, and including in the Pacific, or as they say, the Asia Pacific, which often means Asia, basically. But in East Asia, you will see that there are very important tensions that the Australian regimes have now with China, for example, and that's the major obsession of the US with the Pacific, well, the Asia Pacific region is the role of China, the rise of China, the important influence of China. So, and of course, the organizations that China is involved in, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, the overt attempts now to create a financial system that bypasses the dollar and bypasses the SWIFT system based in Europe, for example. They're very important things that the US is opposed to, and Australia, the Australian governments of both major parties have gone to great lengths to subsidize the North American project. Look at this project of Australia paying almost $400 billion for British and American nuclear submarines. They are no value at all for the security of Australia. They are meant to be involved in this sort of operation to try and contain or limit the power of China. And Australia has been delegated roles by the US in the past, that is to say, to try and control or contain the influence of China in the Pacific Islands. Australia has had an important role in the Pacific Islands, and while there's been a little bit of autonomy there, largely it's integrated with US strategy in the region. So when the US is moving against to try and a new, if you like, containment of China, it's really counting on the Australian government as a type of puppet that it can use to try and contain the role of China.
How do you
This is very
analyze?
dangerous. This is
Yes.
very dangerous for Australia, by the way, because China is Australia's most important trade partner. You know, Indonesia is important, but China has been the biggest trade partner for some time. And ever since I was at school more than 50 years ago, we were being told all the time by all sorts of people, look, we are part of Asia. We should be part of Asia. We should have very good relationships with Asia. And when I went to school, I learned Bahasa Indonesia as part of that process. You know, now I haven't been practiced it very much, but this was very strong current in Australian society for many decades. And now recently with the US rivalry with China, it's something that's being very damaged, and it could be very dangerous for Australian people.
Okay, Mr. Anderson, we discussed about China and Australia. How do you analyze the issue of Taiwan? Is that Taiwan project as another Ukraine project? What do you think?
The Taiwan project, as you call it these days, has become a new pretext, a way for one of the ways for the US to try and destabilize or to destabilize China. Basically, they've had a few others. They've had Hong Kong, of course. The idea of trying to, you know, play some sort of savior role in Hong Kong.
Do you really, Tim Anderson? Do you really believe that you as an ally using a war to get economic benefit for Taiwan
absolutely.
project?
Absolutely, they've done it so many times.
So the war must go. The war must happen in Taiwan.
No, I don't think so. It's a great risk. I don't think it has to happen. I don't think it's inevitable, but there is certainly a rivalry, a strategic rivalry going. The problem is these days, most forms of war that the US is pursuing are proxy wars. They will use other people for their own ends, just as they're using Ukraine against Russia, for example, or they're using fanatical religious groups in the Middle East to divide and weaken Iraq and Syria. They would happily use Taiwan as a proxy if someone else would fight the war for them there.
It is because China and United States can exchange the material benefit. We never think that China will go war with United States because the same root of them is economic benefit. Do you think so?
Yes, I mean the relationship in recent decades has precisely been that. It's been, if you like, a codependent relationship, an interdependent relationship. The US has benefited from its economic relationship with China in many ways. And of course, it puts that at risk by this rivalry, by this conflict, fomenting of conflict. Certainly, China has not been the aggressor in this relationship. China is now going to try and defend itself from these incursions. And, you know, that has some implications for its neighbors. You see that China is now claiming some of the offshore islands, bringing into conflict with the Philippines and Vietnam and so on. But this is because it is surrounded by US bases in the region. The US has a lot of its international bases in the Asia region, the Asia Pacific region. And of course, a lot of that has been aimed at trying to contain the expansion of Chinese influence. But Chinese influence has largely been conventional economic. You know, their power is through their investment and their investment in infrastructure, for example. It hasn't been by exporting wars to other countries or coups and interventions in a way that the US has for many decades.
Last question, Mr. Anderson. What is your hope relation between Australia and Indonesia to escape the hegemony?
Well, I mean, ideally, this is what I was being taught, as I said, in the late 60s, you know, that we are neighbors. We have a very good, positive relationship. Why not? But while we are not an independent country, while we are acting as an appendage of the US and its
Mr.
big power
Tim
rivalry.
Anderson, Australia is very close to, you know, that Jayapura, Irian Jaya, okay?
Yes.
If we want, yeah, just maybe 30 minutes by ship, why we have to go fly from Bali to Australia, to Sydney? Why it's so difficult?
Yes, I mean, the problem is that Australia is this type of schizoid nation. You know, it's it was a British colony, and they've spoken about this idea of being part of Asia. Indeed, here I am sitting in Sydney. 20% of Sydney is Asian now. About half of that is Chinese. The other half is, you know, Filipina, Thai, Vietnamese, and so on. 20% of major cities is now Asian here. We are part of Asia in many ways, but we are still stuck with this old colonial heritage whereby we are subsidizing the war machines in Britain and the US, you know, for their adventures in the Middle East to try and get influence in the Middle East to try and contain China. It's a very damaging thing for us. Naturally, all of our economic relations, our social relations should be very strong. Where I live also, there are the major universities in the center of Sydney. They're full of Asian students. You know, if you come to this part of Sydney, it looks very Asian, basically. But we are stuck with these contradictions of having this idea of a big brother, you know, a big brother that has to protect us in some sort of way. Protect us from what? Our major trade partners. There are huge contradictions in the society, my friend, and it's one of the major dilemmas that Australian people have in dealing with the old, really neo-colonial political system that we have inherited.
Australia is a dream country, I think, the heaven country, because too many immigrants want to stay to get money in
Well,
Australia.
we still have this unresolved problem with Indigenous people here too. There was never really an agreement with Indigenous people here, so that is something that doesn't go away in a hurry. Whereas if you look at the cultural face of Australia, the most unique cultural face of Australia is Indigenous culture, Indigenous art here. People recognise Aboriginal art, for example, but
Will
the political
disappear.
situation
Will disappear,
no,
indigenous.
I mean, they're 3% of the population, but culturally they have a very large presence, you know. So, but the political social relationship has not been resolved at all. And then on top of that, you have the question of immigration and multicultural immigration, which is a very good thing, accepted by Australians for the most part, but it does become a political football. So you have the political elites playing games with some of these sorts of things, which creates problems. I think this happens in a lot of countries, but certainly it's one of our problems here.
Okay, Tim Anderson, thank you very much, Doctor. You are very academically and
You're welcome,
also
Mohammed.
actively. I admire you. Maybe we can talk with another segment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you.